Well, let's take a look at Chapter 3 from the textbook. In this case, we're going to look at the differences between job order costing and process costing. We alluded to those a little bit in Chapter 2. We're going to get into them in more detail here today. A typical job order costing system uses cost of specific jobs. A process costing system uses average cost information as these units sort of move through the system. For example, here we see on the left there's some material being added to this big vat, and then some labor being added by the stirring, and then there's some manufacturing overhead, the cost of the insurance for the plant. I don't know what they're making there, but maybe they need some insurance for that. Those then move into what we call work in process, where we're looking at the number of units that are completed, and we're figuring the average cost per unit. As it moves into finished goods and then out into cost of goods sold, we get the number of units sold and the average unit cost. So we move from applying the material and applying the labor in some kind of a continuous fashion to think of it as liquid that's coming into the process is completed partially, and then the goods are sold. And the costs flow through the system. As the product flows through departments, the cost flows with it. In general, we've got two types of converting or value-added costs: labor and overhead. So we have direct materials, and then we have the conversion cost of direct labor and manufacturing overhead, and then something about transferred in costs that I'll show you in this graphic here. For example, we have a mixing department, and then we have a packaging department, and they're turning out some kind of wood preservative. Again, we've got direct labor, direct material, manufacturing overhead that goes into the cost incurred in packaging, moves into the packaging department, where then we have a transferred in cost, direct labor in the packaging department, and then we have the cost of the completed items that move into finished goods. So from the mixing department to the packaging department to finished goods, the costs follow the product. Very simple question. A process costing system, the answer is B, C, and F. Very different than a job costing system. The best example of a business requiring a process costing system would be, well, I've never been in one of these, but it's probably not a cabinet shop, a furniture restorer, or automobile shop. Imagine soap as some kind of a continuous manufacturing process. In this instance, with process cost system, we're tracing the costs to specific departments. Very different than what we saw in Chapter 2, where we're tracing costs to specific jobs. Here we're tracing the cost to departments, and then the product moves through the departments. Now, because at any one point in time, at the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the month, we may not be completely finished with whatever that they were mixing and stirring in that previous example, we need to introduce this sort of confusing concept of equivalent units. So 100 units that are 50% complete, in other words, that vat might still be bubbling and cooking, and it's only 50% complete, we can say we've actually finished at the end of this period 50 equivalent units. Now, nothing's really done, but we've essentially finished 50 equivalent units. If you look at this little example here of the material and the conversion costs, we've got the stuff being poured into the vat, we've got the person stirring the vat, and we've got material complete, which is the essentially 100 equivalent units, but it's only 50% of the way through the process, so the actual labor equivalents are only 50. Here's an example of a tire company. they ended June with these tires in the process, which were 85% complete with materials and 50% complete with respect to conversion costs. They transferred 2,500 tires to finished goods, 2,300 were started. Beginning WIP was 65% with direct materials, and here we have 50% with respect to conversion costs. These are how we work our way through the materials. Equivalent 2,755 units produced. Labor equivalent 2,650 units produced. Even though we completed 2,500, the equivalent units produced with respect to materials are 2,755, and the equivalent units completed with respect to labor are 2,650. You kind of got to think about that, and I'll show you how we use these terms here a little later. We need to then think about what's the cost per equivalent unit, and we're looking for an average unit cost using a formula that states we get the cost in the beginning WIP plus the cost incurred in the current period divided by the units completed plus the units in ending WIP. Here's an example using a rubber company. At Bing Rubber, the direct labor balance at the beginning of the month was $135,000. During the month, an additional $650,000 of direct labor was incurred. So essentially they layered $650,000 of direct labor costs on top of the $135,000. And that resulted in 25,000 pounds of rubber being produced. Now at the end of March, okay, at the end of March, we have rubber in process, and the units were 50% complete. At the start of March, the company had 5,000 pounds of rubber that were 30% complete. So calculate the cost per equivalent unit for labor, assuming that we add labor through the process. Let me show you quickly how that works. For labor, we have a beginning balance of labor and work in process. We know how much we added during March, so we have a total labor cost. We know how many units we completed during the month, and we know what the equivalent units are. That's 8,000 times 50% complete with respect to labor. So that's 4,000. So the total units completed are 25,000 completely completed plus 4,000 sort of completed gives us 29,000. So the labor cost per equivalent unit is the 785,000 divided by the 29,000 equivalent units, or 27.07 per pound. Got to think about it a little bit. I'm introducing the concept. We'll come back to it in some cases, I promise you. So some of what we have to do at the end of a period is reconcile the number of units, the costs, and the details of our cost per equivalent unit calculations. Units should reconcile. If they don't, we got some units we need to account for. Who knows? Maybe they're going out the door in people's lunch boxes. Costs have to also reconcile. Here you can see beginning plus and has to reconcile. So again now, to summarize the basic steps in process costing, Chapter 3, versus job costing, Chapter 2, are first, account for the number of physical units, then calculate the cost per equivalent unit for materials, labor, and overhead. Then assign that cost to the items completed and the items in ending work in process. That should account for the total amount of product cost. Remember also that process costing systems generally use multiple processes: the mixing process, the packing process, the shipping process, and so forth. And remember that items move from one processing department to the other, and the costs move along with them. Only when the units are completed and in the final process do the costs get transferred to the cost of finished goods. So process costing uses an average of fixed and variable cost. Remember, we have to compute equivalent costs. And it's important to really understand this when we're trying to make decisions about additional production. How much does one more unit of product cost? Again, we're trying to apply this to making business decisions. They're not always simple, but we're going to try and illustrate the concepts in this slide with some of our cases throughout the term. I know it's a little bit tough to really absorb just by looking at the PowerPoints, but there'll be some homework problems that you can use to practice this on as well. Thanks.